The ultimate goal is to build your family and keep your focus on that joy and the fulfillment, the hope that lies ahead. We offer support groups as well. It's a community, and to reach out and don't isolate yourself.
If you are still going through IVF and you're talking to us at the same time, or you have a spontaneous pregnancy, don't be afraid to tell us. We are your biggest cheerleaders. It makes our day. And if we get to be part of that journey in any capacity, whether it's one phone call, whether you have had your implications counseling with us, or you have received donated embryos, had an FET, and have a baby 9 months later, it's the best part of our job. And we want to be here to support you no matter where you are in that journey.
Hi, superhumans. I'm Dr. Mavis Garcia.
And I'm Dr. Wise.
We're two of the physician leaders at Markham Fertility Center, otherwise known as Our Baby, MFC.
As fertility specialists, we've witnessed firsthand the challenges, triumphs, and the myriad of emotions that come with trying to conceive. Whether you're just starting to think about having a baby, actively trying, or facing challenges along the way, My Fertility Podcast will be your go-to resource for honest conversations and a supportive community.
So grab a cup of coffee or tea and settle in, and let's demystify the world of fertility together.
On today's episode of My Fertility Podcast, we're going to be talking about embryo adoption. We are joined by Elaine and Julia from Beginnings. Beginnings is a private adoption agency that has been working with Canadian families since 1985. They are licensed by the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services to provide adoption services in Ontario. Beyond Ontario, they can provide adoption services on a case-by-case basis in provinces and territories that have provisions for private adoption. They also do embryo adoption, which is quite unique as they are the only adoption agency in Canada at the time of recording that offers this service. Elaine is the manager of the Beginnings Embryo Donor / Recipient Program, and she's a therapist working within the Halton and Hamilton communities to support individuals and families. Julia is the Embryo and Donor Recipient Program Coordinator, has been working with Beginnings since 2019.
Thank you very much, Elaine and Julia, for joining us today. We're delighted that you could spend the afternoon with us.
Thank you for having us.
So to start, let's talk about Beginnings. Not a lot of people in the fertility community know what it is, what it does, that they exist, yet there's lots of people that can really use your services. So why don't you tell us what Beginnings is and how do you help people who are looking to grow or build their families?
Beginnings Family Services started facilitating private adoption, like traditional adoption, domestic adoption, since 1984. And we still do that. So that's a whole other arm of work that we do, where we work with birth parents and prospective adoptive parents. But in 2010, we started the Embryo Donor and Recipient Program, knowing that there are various ways for a child to become part of a family. And the neat thing about what we do is that we're a national program. So we're not just about servicing Ontario families. Over the years, there came the knowledge that some individuals and couples facing infertility were opting for adoption, but others were using the assisted reproductive technologies that were continuing to grow, like in vitro fertilization, to build their families. But many of those unused embryos were remaining stored in fertility clinics across Canada. And so once their family is complete, those that had frozen embryos, they faced a difficult decision in terms of what to do with the remaining embryos. And even from my own experience, because I went through the process in the late 90s, we were limited in terms of what to do with those remaining embryos. It was either destroying them, leaving them stored indefinitely, or donating them for medical research. So Beginnings in 2010 offered the Embryo Donor Program, and it allows those who have successfully used IVF to donate their remaining embryos to individuals struggling to become parents. And it's an altruistic donation process. It provides hope. It provides those embryos a chance at life.
That is amazing.
So what precipitated this? Like, how does an adoption agency start even thinking about embryos and embryo adoption? How did that all start? What was the ignition, I guess, to get that idea going?
A lot of it was simply because so many adoptive applicants that our previous directors were seeing had either engaged in ART already or were told that it wouldn't be successful without double donors. And there are always more individuals and families looking to adopt a child than there are babies being placed for adoption. There was a lot of discussions between Mary Howlett Nero, who piloted our program back in 2010, and Carrie Vandergrift, who was the agency director at the time, looking at alternative ways to support families that were hoping to have a child. And they had heard about similar things in the States and even a few clinics in Canada, but everything was always anonymous. And adoption in Ontario is open. We always promote openness for our clients for the benefit of the child so that they don't run into that, DNA test at 18 going, "Hey, mom, dad, what happened here?" And between their discussions, they realized this is something that no one offers here. There's no open program. There are many folks that could benefit from receiving donated embryos because maybe, oocyte donation is too financially prohibitive for them. And so that's how our program kind of started, was a lot of conversations. I think the two of them had a lot of late night discussions and emails back and forth. But 14 years later, it's amazing to see how far the program's come and how their vision has grown and multiplied.
Yes, absolutely. And here at Markham Fertility Center, as you know, together with Beginnings, we have been part of those journeys, and
Yeah.
actually had Alison on our podcast, episode 19, where she shares her experience coming to Beginnings, and then from Beginnings being referred to Markham Fertility Center, and ultimately becoming parents that way.
Yeah, it was great to see what her experience was with us and with your clinic.
You know how many babies have been born since 2010 when the program started?
And Julia will correct me if I've got the numbers wrong, but the first baby was born in 2013. Since then, approximately about 75 babies have been born.
Wow.
Almost 80 now.
Almost 80 now.
Wow.
In 2024 alone, we welcomed about 7 babies, and 2 more are expected this year. One is due in 2025. We encourage recipients to keep us informed, and we do our best to follow up with them and with the families. We hope we have the accurate numbers because we get excited. We want to know, right? So,
Yes, absolutely.
yeah.
All right. So we know that Beginnings is an agency that matches people that have extra embryos that want to donate them with people that want to be the recipient of embryos that want to use these embryos to become parents. So I'm going to ask you some questions from the perspectives of the people who are donating embryos. And then we'll ask you some questions from the perspective of people who are receiving these donated embryos to establish a pregnancy. So from the perspectives of people who want to donate their embryos, how does somebody become a Beginnings client and is able to be part of the MASH process to donate their embryos?
Usually they find out about us either through their clinic or through the website or through social media or the podcast, right? And so they just call in and we will have them fill out an intake form just so we can get some specific information. And then we will do a consult. I mean, we do have some criteria for donation. We ask that donors have a minimum of 2 embryos to donate. This ensures that the recipient has at least 2 opportunities to try and become a parent, given the costs associated with fertility treatments and reports and coordination and the legal expenses. For one embryo, it may not really be attractive to a recipient, right, to be matched with just one. And then grading and the thawing medium that is used. Julia has done a lot of research and studying, so she's really good at understanding the grading, and I'm still learning. I just started at Beginnings in September of 2023, but I'm getting there. We're not doctors or scientists, so we look at what the grading is, and if we have any questions, we will send the embryology report to an embryologist to review. So any embryos that we would accept into our program are viable.
Is there a cost for people that want to donate embryos to be part of the program?
No, there's no cost. This is an altruistic donation for them. The expenses that are incurred for legal fees or shipping are paid for by the recipient, but that the donor needs to have their storage fees up to date.
I'm sure a lot of people are listening to this as fertility patients. They might be wondering if there is any criteria specifically for, let's say, age, like the age of the provider of the egg at the time the embryos were made, or whether they have to be PGT, like genetically tested or not. And then what if there is donor gametes involved? So what if the embryo is, involves donor egg, but let's say it's the sperm from the intended parent or vice versa. Are there any requirements or criteria around that?
I'll take that one because I love talking about this stuff.
Sure.
We don't have any really specific criterion other than at least 2 embryos from any donor. If there has been PGT completed on the embryos, we'll request a copy of that. Where we might run into issues is if they have 2 embryos, one is euploid and one is aneuploid. So again, they meet the criteria of having 2, but it might be very difficult to find a recipient that's willing to take those embryos. If the second embryo is mosaic, then it might depend on the genetic abnormality that's been identified in that mosaicism. So again, we would always tell folks to speak with a genetic counselor to make sure that they understand if that embryo could be considered viable, if their fertility specialist would recommend transferring it and attempting a pregnancy, or if they would advise against it. Obviously, like we see in everything, there's going to be some recipients that are open to whatever. They just want to hopefully have a chance at having a child. And they might be willing to take embryos that were slow frozen in 1995 with a female donor that was 46 at the time of creation. Whereas other recipients might really be looking for embryos that were vitrified in the last 5 to 7 years with a female donor that's under the age of 37. We have seen some folks take chances on embryos that medically are not the greatest looking on paper that have become healthy, happy babies. And we have seen those PGT normal, 5AA, amazing looking under a microscope that haven't resulted in a pregnancy. So it really is up to the recipients and their clinic what they're comfortable working with. In regards to if they've used donor gametes, a lot's going to depend on the contract that they signed with their sperm or ovum provider. We need to make sure that legally they have the ability to donate those embryos on to a third party. Some gamete donors were not comfortable with that. And in the contract, it says they can't, in which case, unfortunately, we're not legally able to proceed with an embryo donation plan. Anyone that has utilized donor eggs or sperm, first thing we tell them is, we need a copy of your contract. We need to make sure that it is in place, that you have the legal ability. When it's older, donor sperm particularly, not all sperm banks had a contract specific to that. So we have to then make sure that we have a paper trail of conversation with the sperm bank representatives stating that there's nothing hindering that donation process.
It's all about making informed decisions so that donors know exactly what the expectation is and that the recipients know what we're going to be able to provide from them, to know that there's no guarantee of a match, to know that we're going to give them the information, but it's ultimately their responsibility to check with their clinic to ensure that their clinic will accept the embryos.
So now from the perspective of the patients that are looking to receive donated embryos as a way to establish a family like Allison did, let's talk about that. What is the criteria to be accepted into the program from that point of view?
Our main criteria is that you're a Canadian resident over the age of 18. You can be a single applicant or in a relationship. If it is a single applicant or a 2-parent applicant, typically we do ask that one of the patients is able to carry a pregnancy. And that's just because there's so much additional legal work, psychological implications counseling involved when gestational carriers are utilized. So far, our program has been requesting that at least one person be able to carry a pregnancy. Beyond that, We don't have any age restrictions or restrictions regarding marital status, religion, ethnicity, sexual or gender identity. It's, are you able to carry a pregnancy, and do you have a clinic that is willing to work with you and perform an FET?
I see.
And what are the costs associated with becoming part of the program and hoping to match with somebody to accept donated embryos?
Overall, we state that approximately embryo donation costs $12,000 to $15,000. So of that, about $7,500 is paid to Beginnings. So that's your agency fees, your implications counseling that we do for both the donors and the recipients, and all of our coordination between the shipping companies and the clinics. It's also going to include the legal agreement that you're paying directly to lawyers. There's 2 lawyers involved in any embryo donation agreement, one to represent the intended parent and one to represent the donor, to make sure everyone understands under the law what their roles are and that ownership is transferred once that's completed. And in the best case scenario, the embryos are at the same clinic. So there's no shipping fee. And that's fantastic when it happens. Unfortunately, sometimes we're moving embryos from British Columbia out to Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's when we're going to utilize a shipping company, and that would be paid directly to them. That $12,000 to $15,000 usually includes one FET at the clinic as well. We give a range because we have no say over anyone's clinic schedules for fees, and we want to make sure that we're giving folks a rough estimate. Obviously, if they require more than one FET to achieve a pregnancy, some of those fees would be repeated at their clinic, but none of our fees are repeated for that batch of embryos.
I'd like to add too that our fees, the recipients are billed incrementally. So it's as they progress through the process. So they'll have a consultation fee and then the registration fee. And then if they decide to proceed even beyond that, then the counseling services, because the implications counseling, which is a requirement for third-party reproduction, that's included for the donor and for the recipient. So the recipient will pay for the donor. They create a social medical report or profile so that the donors can review. We help them with that piece and then all the coordination afterwards. So it's all done incrementally. So they're not just getting a big invoice right at the beginning.
That's a really good point. Yeah. So if somebody is looking to adopt an embryo and they've gone through, let's say, the initial consultation with Beginnings, and now they're sitting down and they're going to start sorting through matches or potential matches, what kind of information are they going to see? What kind of information are they going to get? What's that matching process like?
Our recipients or intended parents create a visual profile. So that for themselves is going to be pictures and words that they decide they would like to present to donors. And their profiles will only ever go to the donors they select. When they are ready, we send them non-identifying profiles of all of the donors we have. And that information is going to include the donor's current age, racial and ethnic background, some physical features, so height, weight, hair color, eye color, how they would describe their build, their personality, educational background, work type background, if they identify with any religion. And the most important part is we always include medical information in that. Our donors fill out a lovely long questionnaire for us about their social and medical history. And we include anything that's pertinent to a recipient making a choice of whether or not they're comfortable accepting those embryos. So if the donor's only medical history is they wear glasses and have seasonal allergies, we're not going to include that simply because most folks do. If they have a family member that has schizophrenia, we're going to include that. If they have a family member that was diagnosed with Huntington's, we want to make sure to include that information so that a recipient can make an informed decision. There's always going to be things that come out of nowhere, but we want to provide them with as much information as we can. We'll also make sure that the recipient knows why the donor underwent IVF and what their fertility treatment looked like. So history of miscarriages, what their fertility diagnosis was, as well as information about the embryos. When they were frozen, the grading on those embryos, if they've had PGT, and if there's anything specific about the freezing media that a recipient might need to talk to their clinic about. We've had one clinic tell us that CryoLoop are awful to work with. So if we see a report that says, hey, these embryos were frozen in cryoloop, we're going to include that so that they can talk to their clinic to make sure they have the technology and comfort level to work with those embryos. And then what the donor is looking for in regards to what type of recipient family. Some donors are open to anyone. They just want the right fit. Others might be very specific in criteria. They might say, I want a heterosexual white couple within 2 hours of Toronto. So for those donors, the pool of recipients is going to be a lot smaller than donors who are open to a wider variety of folks. And what type of relationship they're hoping for with the recipient family. Whether it's pictures and updates a couple times a year, whether it's in-person visits, or if it's just the sharing of medical information for the sake of all the children involved in this relationship, with the understanding that that child might reach out to them in the future, and are they okay with that?
Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think it's beautiful that you emphasize the non-anonymity of this process and the fact that it is an open adoption process. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yes, we take the same framework as we do with a traditional adoption because we're very child centered. So even though these little embryos haven't been born, we think about it from that perspective of their story. And we believe that openness is most beneficial for children. We've seen that when we've spoken with donor conceived people about their experience and finding out later and the trauma of that and not knowing and being able to have the right to their genetic information. And we also know that maintaining those relationships during the process could grow into either relationships between the genetic siblings so that they will have that moving forward, and that'll always be part of their extended family. And if they don't have that type of openness, then at least they will have the knowledge of who they are, where they can reach them, if there's any medical information. And it doesn't become this huge, serious sit down conversation about their story. It's just something that they've always known. And there are a lot of books for recipients and donors, children's books for really young kids to talk about the different ways that families can be created.
For the people who are looking to receive a donated embryo, is there a home study involved?
So if folks have had a home study, that's great. They already have a lot of knowledge of raising a child that's not genetically related to them because they've gone through their pride training, they've done their home study, they've had some of these hard conversations already, but it's not required for embryo donation. We do almost like a mini psychosocial report that is a very condensed version of a home study that is utilized to provide the donors with some more background information about the recipients and what their lifestyle looks like to make sure they're comfortable donating their embryos. But it's not required for them to go and do 27 hours of pride and 8 to 10 hours minimum work with a social worker to get a home study.
We do require a police check, however, just so that donors know that that has been at least done. We will provide with consent copies of those psychosocial report information to the donors and vice versa. We do those with the donors as well. Donors don't need the police report, but we do a psychosocial report with the donors and the implications counseling that's also required.
So the matching process starts on the recipient side or the donor side? In other words, is the recipient going to see all profiles, and then the people who donate the embryos only see the profiles that the recipients picked, or the other way around?
Yes. So the recipients review first because there's no identifying information in the donor profiles. They know the general location of where the donors are in a general description, but we never want to have a recipient have a donor review their profile and they have no interest in that donor. It can make a really awkward conversation for everyone. So we typically ask the recipients to decide what donors they're interested in first, and then the donors will only see those profiles. It's also to protect everyone's identity and anonymity that, we're not sending 30 profiles to a donor when maybe only 4 of those families would actually be interested.
Right. So then the recipient reviews all the profiles. Let's say they pick 5.
We do presentations one at a time. So we do ask our recipients to rank the donors in preference order, with the understanding that we might have to flip things around a little bit. So we might present to their second choice first, just depending on consensus. We do our best to keep it in chronological order, but unfortunately, not everyone always has the same views, right? So we would send to one donor first, have the 5 profiles reviewed by that donor. They would choose a recipient, and then anyone who was not selected by that donor would then be presented to the next donor.
Okay, got it. So once the match takes place, so at some point a donor is going to say, I want the recipient is going to say, I want this donor. What happens next?
Once they've selected their match, we will then contact the donor by phone and read to them the psychosocial report and the implications counseling report of their recipient. And this will have more information for them that would be in addition to the profile that they had reviewed and selected the recipient from. This gives them an opportunity to ask any more questions, and then they can decide if they want to move forward in terms of a first meeting. Once they have selected the recipient, we will then call the recipient and read the psychosocial report and the implications counseling of the donor to them and ensure that they would still like to move forward with the first meeting and that they're still comfortable, or if they have any further questions. And from that, if they both are in agreement, we will then schedule the first meeting, and that is facilitated by one of us. It's a little awkward at the beginning for them. They're a little bit nervous, but we have it facilitated well. And during that meeting, we ask, what it was that had made you select each other. What was the reasons behind the connection? What do you want the connection to look like going forward? So we will talk about openness. Sometimes the donors will have their children in on that first meeting. So it's really exciting for the recipients to see the children. And we use that as a way for donors and recipients to gauge their level of comfort, because even at that stage, they can change their mind, right? And we can talk about that because that can happen. It doesn't usually happen, but it can happen. But if everything's going well, then what will happen is sometimes they'll say, okay, we want to stay connected right off the bat, and we'll exchange emails right then and there during that first meeting. And it also provides the foundation for the openness agreement. It's not sort of set in stone, but it's a starting off point. And then we will write that openness agreement up to say, based on this, this is where we're starting. And that could mean we would like to stay connected prior to transfer. We would like to know that there's a pregnancy, because openness is a continuum. So it could be just letters or an email and pictures, or it could be maybe we'll FaceTime and meet down the road, or just to let the relationship sort of grow organically. That's what that meeting does. And then we check in with each of the parties and see if they're still feeling good. And if they're still feeling good, then we will provide the list of lawyers for the recipients and for the donors. They will each pick different lawyers, but they're lawyers that do this work that we're very familiar with, which a lot of the clinics are familiar with. And then we leave it to the lawyers to take over. And once we're ready and notified that everything's been signed, then we can work with the coordination of shipping.
And just from the point of view of a fertility specialist, I would say before the lawyers get involved, usually I have patients come to me and say, Smash, these are the embryos that I'm considering. What do you think? And then we say, kind of like you mentioned, it's 46 low freeze. Okay, here are where the odds are versus different embryos. So I think that would be a good time to check in with your fertility specialist before signing the lawyer contracts and make sure they are on the same page. And before you even get there, more important to touch base with your fertility specialist, making sure there is no fibroids, that there is no uterine scarring, that your hemoglobin A1C is optimized, your thyroid levels are optimized, all of those things, because The last thing that you want is to finally get these embryos and then have a medical issue on the side of carrying the pregnancy that you could have been managing all along, while at the same time getting matched with embryos.
Yes, that's a very good point. And that is one of the things that, in terms of the criteria for recipients that we missed, is that they do have to get a medical prior to ensure that they can carry the pregnancy and that there won't be any complications. And after that first meeting, that embryology report, we do get the consent signed so that we can communicate and provide that embryology report to the recipients in full so that they can have that appointment with their clinic and review that before the legal agreement is done.
It's also really important, I think, to point out that not all clinics will accept outside embryos. Actually, in fact, very few clinics will accept outside embryos. So, for instance, as you mentioned, you may be shipping embryos from, I think you said Vancouver to Halifax, and not all fertility clinics will accept embryos that were frozen at an outside lab. Before you get even too far deep into the embryo donation process, it would be a good idea, if you are working with a fertility clinic, to ask whether they would accept embryos from another clinic, or whether that might be a time to get a referral to a clinic that does accept outside embryos to be able to start that process there. Because as we know, the time to get a referral, to get an appointment, to get all the records released and everything so that your new fertility doctor can get up to speed, so to speak, can take a little bit of time as well. But I think that that's something that is really important. And certainly I've seen lots of patients who've come to see me specifically for that reason, where they're coming to MFC because they know that we do accept embryos from outside labs.
And it's not just embryos from outside labs, it's donated embryos.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, a clinic may accept outside embryos. Like if they're your embryos, you make them in another clinic and you want to transfer to the clinic. Not every clinic does that, but most clinics do that. But donated embryos is a whole different story.
Now, in terms of these recipients and these donors, can you give us a ballpark idea in terms of what the ratio is of recipients to donors? I guess people just want to know, what are their odds of success, right? Are they going to be able to find a match or not?
Generally speaking, and this number can literally fluctuate between right now and 10 minutes from now when I go check my email. So take it with a grain of salt. But usually we have about a 2 recipient to 1 donor ratio. And sometimes it's 1 to 1, sometimes it's 1 to 2. It really depends on what time of the year it is. We see huge waves. Usually when the new year starts, everyone starts getting their storage bills. Suddenly we have a lot more donors interested in the program. Usually around Christmas, same thing with recipients. They're like, oh, I'd like to have a baby for next Christmas. So we get more recipient inquiries around the holidays and usually around Labor Day as well, as everyone's going back to work after the summer. But timelines for a match and likelihood of a match are going to be so case by case specific. It's really hard to put timelines on it. And I know that's always one of the first 3 questions I get when I'm talking to a potential recipient on the phone or via email. How quickly can I get a match? How quickly can I have a transfer? And I wish I had a specific thing to give them. I really do. I have seen some recipients get matched on their first presentation, which is amazing. And it's their first choice donor, the first presentation. They feel a connection. They get pregnant on their first or second transfer. And it's amazing. So Allison, that was on episode 19, she was one of those clients that got matched on their first choice, first round of presentations, which was so phenomenal for her because she and her husband had been through a lot to get to that point. And we were so thrilled for them. We've had other folks that are registered with us for sometimes over 2 years and unfortunately are not getting a match. And it could be for a variety of reasons. It could be that they are very particular and they only want PGT embryos, right? And as much as we try and do psychosocial implications counseling and make sure that they understand that PGT is great, but it doesn't guarantee you a baby at the end of 9 months, preconceived notions might make it that that's their main criteria, right? So they're not willing to look at any embryos that aren't PGT. Or sometimes for folks that are looking for a racial or cultural match, that might be a longer wait just because, unfortunately, as I'm sure the two of you see regularly, there are huge disparities in the fertility world, especially for Black individuals that are looking for racial and cultural matches, whether it be with donor gametes or donor embryos. Unfortunately, for our Black clients, they might have a smaller pool of donors that they're working with. So they might be waiting longer than your typical white couple that is like, we just want some embryos. This will work great. They might be matched quicker. The other things we're going to look at is what their background is. Do they already have any children in their family for the recipient? Are they pushing 50? Unfortunately, some donors are very specific and they want a family that does not have children yet or that is under 40 when they're applying. To answer timelines, there is no specific one. I'm sorry. Usually we say about 6 to 18 months is the average with outliers on each side.
That's extremely helpful because I think that you're right. That's like the second or third question that's out of people's mouths in terms of timeline, because as we're always talking about time and always the clock is ticking and time is of the essence. And I know fertility patients feel that acutely. And so giving people at least a little bit of an idea is extremely helpful.
So, Elaine, we were chatting a little bit before the recording started, and you told me that you have a personal connection to the field of embryo adoption or adoption in general, and that you have a story that led you here. Would you like to share that with us?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So, in my, I don't want to age myself, but in my late 20s, I wanted to start a family with my partner, and we had some fertility challenges. And just like a lot of your patients, we started with Clomid, and then we went through IUIs and all of the testing. And then the decision was made to do IVF. So this would have been in the late 90s when technology was different. And it was at that stage where, they were transferring 3-day fresh embryos. There were a lot of embryos, but I wasn't successful. So I never had to make that decision in terms of what to do with them. I remember thinking about how that was going to be a very difficult decision to make, because I thought, oh, I'm in my late 20s with these embryos. I'm going to definitely get pregnant and I'll probably end up with 3. And I didn't end up with any. But the blessing for me was that I also went through traditional adoption. And at that time, Russia was open in terms of adopting. And at the age of 29, I adopted my daughter from south of Siberia. So that was a whole other experience. So I really can empathize with people who go through both processes, the stages of grief, the roller coaster ride, feeling hopeful, but not wanting to feel too hopeful. At the same time, not being able to really enjoy the experience, when you do get a positive pregnancy test, because that did happen, and then you miscarry. It is quite a journey. So we're very aware at beginnings of what people have gone through, where they might be at in their grief and loss, fertility issues, and fertility is a trauma. And we approach it in a trauma-informed way.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So, just to wrap up, do you guys have any words you want to put out into the world? Any statements, anything you want either donors or recipients to know about you, about beginnings, about the process, anything that you want to share with our listeners from that perspective?
I would say that the ultimate goal is to build your family and keep your focus on that joy and the fulfillment, the hope that lies ahead. Because we have seen, and even outside of beginnings, I have seen people who really didn't think that they were going to be able to have that fulfilled for them. Contact us because we offer support groups as well. It's a community, and to reach out and don't isolate yourself, because it is hard, but not to give up hope.
And I think the only thing I would want to add is if you are still going through IVF and you're talking to us at the same time, or you have a spontaneous pregnancy, don't be afraid to tell us. We are your biggest cheerleaders. Every time we hear someone got matched through adoption, someone got pregnant, someone had a baby, there's never a moment of us going, ugh, well, they didn't use our program. We are so thrilled to hear about these things. It makes our day And if we get to be part of that journey in any capacity, whether it's one phone call, whether you have had your implications counseling with us, or you have received donated embryos, had an FET, and have a baby 9 months later, it's the best part of our job. And we want to be here to support you no matter where you are in that journey. And you can call us just to rant on the phone if you need to.
Yes.
We are here for it because it really does make our work personable and what we love about it and why we enjoy working with our clients.
Well, thank you so much, Julia and Elaine, for spending the afternoon with us. This is very helpful. I learned a lot, actually. I mean, I've used the program, obviously, as one of the physicians at microfertility centers, and I can picture in my mind names and patients and stories associated with beginnings. But there's a lot of details that I've learned just by talking to you today.
Thank you so much for your insights and for providing that sense of hope that I'm really getting from you guys and that sense of worth. I think that any patient who works with you guys would be very lucky to do so. And I would be very happy to have mutual patients again in the future.
Thank you for having us. This has been very exciting for us to be part of your podcast, and we look forward to working with you.
Likewise.
Awesome.
And that's a wrap for today, Superhumans.
If you're looking to connect, get social with us. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at My Fertility Podcast or visit us online at myconfertility.com. And don't forget, follow, subscribe, and share your favorite episode.
Thanks for listening to My Fertility Podcast and for being a vital part of our community. We know you've got this.
We're signing off until next Tuesday.
If you found this episode of My Fertility Podcast helpful, please take a moment to head over to the review section and leave us your thoughts. Your reviews and comments are incredibly valuable to us and help guide future episodes. We also welcome you to direct your questions to info@myfertilitypodcast.com.
My Fertility Podcast is produced by Rabbit Media Inc. in conjunction with Dr. Garcia and Dr. Weiss. Music from Mix Kit Raising Me Higher by Ajay Stelino. My Fertility Podcast is not intended to replace any type or variation thereof professional medical, health, or legal advice, nor should the content be taken as medical advice. Please contact your primary healthcare professional regarding any medical questions you may have. The information presented in this podcast is based on the knowledge and understanding of the host at the time of recording. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, and new research may change the understanding of health-related topics. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we do not guarantee the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the content. The views expressed in this podcast by guests are not those of the host or the management. This podcast is not intended to impose any type of discrimination. My Fertility Podcast and its management are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast.